Have you ever wondered why a people who reject electricity, cars, and modern convenience still manage to eat better than most of America? Step into an Amish kitchen at 5 in the morning and you won't find shortcuts. You'll find flour dusted across a worn wooden table, a wood stove already breathing heat into the room, and a woman who has never owned a microwave feeding 12 people on almost nothing. These 60 recipes were never written down in a cookbook with a glossy cover. They were passed hand to hand, kitchen to kitchen, and most American families have never tasted a single one. Number 60. Amish Breakfast Casserole. Before sunrise, before the barn chores are even finished, this dish is already baking. Shredded hash browns form the base, layered with scrambled eggs, crumbled sausage, and a thick blanket of cheddar cheese, then left in the oven while the family works the farm. There's no watching, no stirring, no fuss. Just heat doing its slow work while hands are busy elsewhere. In Amish households, breakfast has to feed a dozen mouths on a farmer's budget, and this casserole does exactly that. Eggs from the hen house, sausage from the smokehouse, cheese from the cellar. Nothing purchased. Everything grown, raised, or made at home. Number 59. Scrapple. This is not a delicacy. This is what happens when nothing from the hog goes to waste. Pork scraps, trimmings, and even the bits most Americans would throw away are simmered down, mixed with cornmeal and buckwheat flour, then poured into a loaf pan to set overnight in a cold cellar. By morning, it slices clean and fries in a cast iron skillet until the edges turn dark and crisp. Pennsylvania Dutch farmers built this recipe around a single unspoken rule. An animal that gave its life deserves to be used completely. Scrapple is proof that respect for food can taste like something worth savoring, not something to apologize for. Number 58. Milk toast. When the pantry is thin and the morning is cold, this is what an Amish grandmother makes, without a second thought. A slice of yesterday's bread, toasted hard in a skillet, then set into a bowl and covered in warm milk sweetened with a spoon of sugar and a dusting of cinnamon. The bread softens slowly, soaking up the warmth until it becomes something between a soup and a pudding. There is no recipe card for this. It lives only in memory, made for sick children, tired husbands, and anyone who needed comfort more than they needed a full meal. Simple, warm. Enough. Number 57. Fried mush cornmeal, water and salt, cooked low and slow until it thickens into something you can pour into a loaf pan. Left overnight in a cold spring house, it sets firm enough to slice. Come morning, thick slabs go into a hot skillet with butter or bacon grease until a golden crust forms on both sides. Drizzled with molasses or maple syrup, it becomes breakfast for almost nothing. Corn was cheap. Corn was always cheap. And an Amish kitchen never let cheap mean poor. Fried mush turned a handful of cornmeal into a dish with crunch, sweetness, and enough substance to carry a farmhand through a full morning of field work. Number 56. Egg gravy. Sawmill gravy. Flour browned in bacon drippings. Milk stirred in slowly until it thickens. Then chopped hard-boiled eggs folded through at the end. Poured hot over split biscuits, it turns two of the cheapest ingredients on any farm, eggs and flour, into a breakfast substantial enough for a man about to spend 10 hours behind a plow. This gravy has no beef, no ham, no meat at all beyond what the chickens already gave freely. It was built for mornings when the smokehouse was low but the hen house was full, and it never once tasted like a substitute. Number 55. Shoofly pie, breakfast version. Shoofly pie, eaten the way it was originally intended, for breakfast alongside black coffee. Molasses, brown sugar, and a crumb topping of flour and butter, baked into a pie crust until the middle turns dense and syrupy. The name comes from having to shoo flies away from the cooling pie on a windowsill. This was never dessert in Pennsylvania Dutch kitchens. It was a way to start the day on cheap molasses instead of expensive sugar, dense enough to hold a farmer through the morning's first hours of work. A slice of pie for breakfast sounds indulgent now. In 1890, it was simply practical, number 54. Amish Friendship Bread. This one isn't just a recipe, it's a chain that never breaks. A bubbling starter of flour, sugar, and milk gets divided every 10 days. One portion baked into a cinnamon-sweet loaf. The rest passed to a neighbor in a plastic bag with handwritten instructions. No one remembers whose starter it originally was. That's the point. In communities where cash was scarce but connection wasn't, this bread became a quiet currency. A way of saying, I'm thinking of you without spending a single dollar. Some Amish families claim their starter has been alive, kitchen to kitchen, for over 60 years. Number 53. White bread, not store bread. Not the soft, sealed-in plastic loaf that sits on a shelf for 2 weeks without a trace of mold. This bread is baked twice a week in most Amish kitchens, using lard instead of oil, and a starter of yeast that's been fed and watched like a living thing. The dough gets kneaded by hand until it turns smooth and elastic under the palm, then left to rise near the wood stove where the air is warm and slightly sweet with the smell of yeast working. 2 loaves, sometimes 4, go into the oven at once, because bread this good disappears fast in a house with 8 or 10 children. By the 1940s, a single loaf of this bread cost the flour, the lard, and almost nothing else. Pennies, really, when the wheat came from the family's own field. Here's what the food industry doesn't want you to know. The softness of a grocery store loaf comes from dough conditioners and preservatives, chemicals with names longer than the ingredient list itself. This bread has 4 ingredients and a woman's hands. It goes stale in 2 days because nothing in it was built to last forever. That was the whole point. Number 52, soft pretzels. In Lancaster County, this dough gets shaped by hand into the familiar twist, then dropped briefly into boiling water mixed with baking soda before it ever sees the oven. That boiling bath is what gives the pretzel its dark, shiny crust and its faintly bitter, unmistakable flavor. Coarse salt goes on while the dough is still wet, so it clings rather than falling off. Pulled from the oven, the outside is deep mahogany brown, the inside soft enough to pull apart in warm, doughy strands. Amish bakeries in Pennsylvania have sold these from roadside stands and market stalls since the early 20th century, wrapped in wax paper for a nickel a piece by the 1930s. Today, a mall pretzel chain charges $6 for a version made with dough conditioners and reheated under a lamp until the crust turns rubbery instead of crisp. Grandma just called it Tuesday baking. There was no branding, no mascot, no bag of powder mixed with water to save time. Just flour, yeast, a pot of boiling water, and hands that had done this so many times they didn't need to measure anymore. The dough remembered what the hands already knew. Number 51, cornbread, skillet style, a cast iron pan, heated empty on the stovetop until it's nearly smoking, then greased with a spoonful of bacon drippings saved from breakfast. The batter, cornmeal, buttermilk, an egg, barely any sugar, hits that hot fat and sizzles the instant it's poured in. That sizzle is the whole secret. It's what gives the bottom crust its deep, almost burnt edge crunch, while the inside stays yellow and tender as custard. In Amish farmhouses across Ohio and Indiana, this pan has often been passed down 3 generations, seasoned black with decades of grease that no soap has ever touched. Corn was cheap. Corn was always cheap, sometimes grown right outside the kitchen window. A slice of this cornbread, crumbled into buttermilk or drizzled with sorghum, could stretch a thin supper into something that felt whole. This was not a side dish. This was often the meal itself, with meat reserved for Sundays and company. The skillet did the work modern non-stick pans can't manage. That crust, that contrast, that particular kind of crisp only cast iron and real fat can build. Number 50, angel biscuits. a strange hybrid, part yeast bread, part baking powder biscuit. Built by Amish cooks who wanted the fluffiness of a biscuit with the forgiveness of a yeast dough that could sit in the icebox for days without ruining. Buttermilk, shortening, and a touch of sugar get worked into flour until the dough turns soft and slightly sticky, then cut into rounds and left to rise once more before baking. What comes out of the oven is lighter than a standard biscuit, with layers that pull apart in soft buttery sheets and a golden top that shatters slightly under a knife, because the dough could be made ahead and kept cold. Busy farm wives could shape and bake only what was needed for that meal, keeping the rest ready for tomorrow. In communities where an oven might only be fired up a few times a week to save on fuel, that flexibility mattered as much as the taste. They knew things about dough and patience that we will spend the next 50 years trying to remember. No packet of instant biscuit mix has ever replicated that particular lightness, because the lightness came from time, not chemistry. Number 49. Apple butter bread every fall. Amish families gather for an apple butter boil. Hours of stirring a copper kettle over an open fire until bushels of apples reduce down into something dark, thick, and deeply spiced. What doesn't get canned for winter finds its way into bread like this one, swirled through a simple batter along with cinnamon and a little brown sugar. The apple butter keeps the loaf moist for days, dense in a way that regular quick breads never quite manage, with a color like strong tea and a flavor that tastes like autumn itself. This bread was never planned. It was invented quietly as a way to use up a jar that had gone slightly too thick to spread easily, or one that cracked in the canning process and couldn't be sold at market. Nothing wasted. That was the rule, spoken or not, in every Amish kitchen. A cracked jar of apple butter wasn't a loss. It was next Tuesday's bread, sliced thick and served slightly warm, with a pat of butter melting into the crumb. This loaf carries the entire memory of the harvest inside it. The smoke from the fire, the apples from the orchard, and the patience of a family willing to stir a kettle for 6 hours straight. Number 48. Amish chicken corn soup. This is not a soup you rush. A whole stewing hen, tough and full of flavor, goes into a pot with water and simmers for hours until the meat falls from the bone on its own. That broth, golden, rich, faintly cloudy with rendered fat, becomes the base for everything else. Homemade egg noodles, rolled thin and cut by hand, go in along with sweet corn cut fresh from the cob in late summer, or preserved in jars for the months when the garden lies dormant. A hard-boiled egg, sliced and dropped into each bowl, is the final touch that marks this as company food, the dish served at church gatherings, weddings, and benefit auctions across Lancaster County for over a century. Here's what the food industry doesn't want you to know. Canned chicken soup gets its flavor from sodium and additives because the chicken itself contributes almost nothing. This soup gets its flavor from an actual bird that lived on actual scraps and actual pasture, simmered with actual patience. At community fundraising events, this soup has been ladled from enormous kettles into styrofoam cups for decades, feeding hundreds at a time, the recipe barely changing because it never needed to. Some things are already finished the first time they're made right. Number 47. Bean soup, ham and bean. The ham bone from Sunday's dinner doesn't get thrown away. It goes into a pot with dried navy beans that have soaked overnight, softening slowly into a broth that turns thick and almost creamy as the beans break down. Onion, a little celery if the garden has it, and whatever meat still clings to that bone are all this soup needs. In Amish households across Ohio's Holmes County, one ham could feed a family 3 separate times, sliced for dinner, diced into a casserole the next day, and finally simmered into this soup on the third until every last bit of value had been pulled from it. A pound of dried beans cost only a few cents well into the mid-20th century, cheaper than nearly any other protein a farm family could buy. That is not a coincidence. That is generations of women understanding exactly how far a single animal could stretch if nothing was wasted along the way. This soup thickens as it sits and tastes even better the second day when the flavors have had time to fully settle into each other. Patience rewarded, the way it so often was in these kitchens. Number 46, potato soup, diced potatoes, a bit of onion, and milk, sometimes cream if the cow had been generous that week, simmered together until the potatoes soften and start to break apart, thickening the broth naturally without needing flour or cornstarch. A pat of butter melts in at the very end, along with black pepper and, if there's bacon on hand, a crumble of it scattered over the top. This soup exists in nearly every Amish community because potatoes exist in nearly every Amish root cellar, stored by the bushel through the coldest months of the year. During long Pennsylvania and Ohio winters, when the garden had gone dormant and meat was rationed carefully, this soup was often supper 3 or 4 nights a week, varied slightly with whatever else happened to be on hand. It was never considered boring. It was considered reliable, and in a household feeding 10 mouths on a farmer's income, reliable mattered more than exciting. Grandma just called it soup night. She didn't need a fancier name for something that had never once let the family down. Number 45. Beef and vegetable stew. This dish was built around the toughest, cheapest cuts of beef a family could get: chuck, shank, the parts that require hours of slow cooking to turn tender. Browned first in a heavy pot, then simmered for the better part of an afternoon with root cellar vegetables like carrots, potatoes, and turnips. The meat slowly gives up its toughness, while the broth deepens into something rich and dark. By the time it's ready, a fork can pull the beef apart without resistance. In Amish farming communities, this stew often followed butchering season in late fall, when a portion of a steer or hog had been set aside for the family's own use rather than sale. The cheap cuts stayed home. The prime cuts went to market. That is not progress. That is a specific, deliberate kind of sacrifice made so that a family selling their best beef could still eat something hearty through a hard winter. Served with a thick slice of bread to soak up the broth, this stew asked for nothing except time. No exotic spices, no special equipment, just a pot, a fire, and the discipline to let it sit undisturbed until the toughest meat surrendered completely. Number 44. Cabbage soup. At the tail end of the garden season, when the more delicate vegetables have already been harvested and canned, cabbage remains. Hearty, cheap, and capable of lasting in a root cellar well into winter. Shredded and simmered with a bit of ham or bacon fat, along with onion and a few potatoes, cabbage breaks down into something soft and almost sweet, its sharpness mellowing the longer it cooks. This soup carries a specific kind of frugality. Cabbage was often the last vegetable standing when the garden had otherwise been picked clean, and using it well meant a family didn't have to buy anything additional to fill the pot. In some Pennsylvania Dutch households, a bit of vinegar or a spoonful of brown sugar was stirred in near the end, balancing the cabbage's natural bitterness into something closer to comfort food. This was never a dish anyone bragged about. It was quiet, practical cooking, made by women who understood that survival didn't require complaint, just resourcefulness. A pot of cabbage soup meant the garden had been used completely, down to its very last vegetable, and nothing green had gone to waste in the process. Number 43. Ham and corn chowder thicker and creamier than a standard soup. This chowder leans on diced ham, sweet corn, and potatoes simmered together in milk until the broth turns rich and slightly golden. summer corn, cut from the cob and preserved in jars or frozen in small home freezers by mid-century, made this dish possible well past the growing season, stretching August's harvest into January's dinner table. A little flour whisked into butter thickens the base further, giving the chowder a body closer to a stew than a thin soup. In Amish communities where dairy farming was common, fresh cream sometimes replaced part of the milk, deepening the flavor into something almost decadent by farmhouse standards. A rare treat pulled from ingredients the family already had on hand, rather than anything purchased specifically for the occasion. Today, this same combination, corn, potato, ham, cream, gets sold in restaurants as a rustic chowder for $12 a bowl, garnished with chives, and served in a shallow dish that holds a third of what this pot actually made. The original version fed a family of 8. The restaurant version barely fills one adult and charges accordingly for the privilege. Number 42. Amish Country Casserole Ground Beef, egg noodles, corn, and a tomato-based sauce, all baked together until the noodles soften completely and the top develops a slightly crisped edge where it meets the pan. This dish became a staple precisely because it could be assembled from ingredients nearly every Amish farm family already had in steady supply: beef from their own cattle, corn from the summer garden, noodles rolled by hand or bought cheaply in bulk. One pan could feed a large family with enough left over for the next day's lunch, reheated in the same dish it was baked in. There was no waste in the process. No separate pots for meat and starch and vegetable, just one casserole dish doing the work of an entire meal. In households with 8, 10, sometimes 12 children, that kind of efficiency wasn't a preference. It was a requirement. This casserole rarely appeared at church gatherings or special occasions. It was too ordinary for that, too much of a Tuesday night dish. But ordinary in an Amish kitchen still meant made from scratch, still meant real meat and real vegetables, still meant something a family actually looked forward to eating. Number 41. Meatloaf, Amish style. Ground beef mixed with crushed saltine crackers instead of breadcrumbs, an egg to bind it, finely diced onion, and a glaze of ketchup and brown sugar brushed across the top before baking. The crackers do something breadcrumbs can't quite manage. They soak up the meat's juices while baking, keeping the loaf moist all the way through instead of drying out at the edges. This wasn't a fancy dish, and it was never meant to be. It was a way to stretch a modest amount of ground beef into a meal substantial enough for a large family, the loaf sliced thick and served alongside mashed potatoes and whatever vegetable the garden or the cellar could provide that week. In many Amish households, this meatloaf appeared regularly enough that children could recognize its smell baking in the oven from another room entirely. Sweet, slightly tangy, with an undertone of browned beef fat. It asked for nothing exotic: saltines, ketchup, one egg, and ground beef that had likely come from an animal raised on the family's own land. That was enough. That was, in fact, exactly the point. A full meal built from 4 ingredients nobody had to travel far to find. Number 40. Chicken and waffles, Amish version. Unlike the fried chicken and syrup version popularized in the South, the Amish take on this dish is built around stewed chicken and a rich, savory gravy poured directly over a fresh waffle instead of maple syrup. The chicken, simmered slowly until tender, gets shredded and folded back into its own thickened cooking liquid, creating something closer to chicken and gravy than fried chicken entirely. Waffles made fresh on a stovetop iron rather than an electric one come out slightly denser and chewier than a modern electric waffle, with a texture built to hold up under a heavy pour of gravy without turning to mush. This dish traditionally appeared as a Sunday dinner centerpiece, a way of dressing up an ordinary stewing hen into something that felt like an occasion. In Lancaster County, this combination has been served at Amish-run restaurants for tourists for decades, though the version served to actual Amish families rarely includes the sweets modern diners now expect. Grandma just called it chicken and waffles, no qualifiers needed. She never imagined a version of this dish existing where the chicken was fried, sweetened, and stacked for a photograph rather than simmered patiently and poured over with care. Number 39. Ham loaf ground ham combined with ground pork, bound with breadcrumbs and egg, then baked with a glaze of brown sugar, mustard, and a splash of vinegar that caramelizes into a sticky, dark crust as it cooks. This loaf became a practical solution for using leftover ham scraps, too small or too odd-shaped to serve on their own, ground down and repurposed into something entirely new rather than discarded. The combination of ham and pork gives the loaf a saltier, deeper flavor than a standard meatloaf, while the sweet tangy glaze cuts through that richness with each slice. In many Pennsylvania Dutch communities, ham loaf became a fixture at church potlucks and family reunions, specifically because it could be made in bulk and sliced cold for sandwiches the following day just as easily as it could be served warm. A holiday ham, once stripped down to its last usable pieces, found a second life here rather than being tossed once the good slices were gone. That is the entire philosophy behind this dish, spoken or not. An animal gave its life, and every part of it deserved a place on the table, even the scraps too unglamorous for a formal dinner plate. Number 38. Scalloped potatoes and ham thinly sliced potatoes, layered in a baking dish with diced ham, then covered in a simple white sauce of butter, flour, and milk before baking until the top turns golden and the potatoes soften completely under the sauce. This dish followed almost every holiday ham through an Amish kitchen, built specifically to use up what remained once the main meal had been served, and the bones set aside for soup. Nothing about this recipe required precision. Potatoes sliced slightly thick or thin didn't ruin the dish, and the sauce forgave almost any amount of ham folded into it. That forgiveness mattered in households where cooking happened around chores, childcare, and farm work rather than a clock. A dish could sit in the oven, largely unattended, while a woman tended to a dozen other responsibilities simultaneously. By the time it emerged, bubbling at the edges with a crisp top, an entire ham had been stretched across 3 or 4 separate meals, and not one bit of it had gone toward the compost pile instead of the family table. Number 37. Baked chicken, and filling this dish, holds a specific weight in Amish communities, served most often at weddings, funerals, and the largest community gatherings, prepared in quantities meant to feed hundreds at once. Cubed bread, dried slightly beforehand, gets mixed with butter, celery, onion, and rich chicken broth, then baked alongside pieces of stewing chicken until the whole dish turns into something closer to a savory bread pudding than a traditional stuffing. The bread soaks up the broth slowly, turning custardy in the center, while the top layer crisps under the oven's heat. Because this dish requires large stewing hens and hours of both broth making and baking, it was never an everyday meal. It was reserved specifically for occasions that mattered, occasions where the whole community would gather and need to be fed at once. Amish women in Lancaster and Lebanon counties have prepared this exact dish in enormous roasting pans for wedding celebrations that could include 300 guests or more. There is no rushing a dish built for that many people. Every step, the broth, the drying of the bread, the careful layering, happens a full day or two ahead because feeding a community properly was never something anyone tried to improvise at the last minute. Number 36. Buttered egg noodles, rolled and cut by hand from flour and fresh eggs, boiled just until tender, then tossed simply with melted butter and a bit of salt. Nothing else. No sauce, no cheese, no herbs beyond what the dish absolutely required. This was never meant to be a centerpiece. It was a side, a base, something to accompany a stew or a roast that needed a starch capable of soaking up gravy without competing for attention. The simplicity here was deliberate, not accidental. Amish cooks understood that a dish this plain needed to be made from genuinely good ingredients, because there was nowhere for poor quality to hide. Fresh eggs from the henhouse gave the noodles their deep yellow color and slightly chewy bite, a texture entirely different from the pale, mass-produced dried noodles found in modern grocery stores. This was not a side dish born from laziness. This was a side dish born from restraint. The understanding that sometimes the best way to honor good butter and fresh eggs was to let them speak plainly, without a single distraction standing between the ingredient and the plate. Number 35. Creamed peas and potatoes. One of the first dishes of the growing season, built around the earliest vegetables a garden produces. Young peas, still sweet and tender, and small new potatoes, barely larger than a marble, simmered gently in a light cream sauce, thickened with flour and butter. This dish celebrated the end of a long winter of root cellar, vegetables, and preserved goods, a genuine taste of something fresh after months of eating from jars. In many Amish households, the first pot of creamed peas and potatoes each spring carried a kind of quiet celebration with it, even if no one ever called it that out loud. The vegetables required almost no seasoning beyond salt and a bit of black pepper, because their flavor at that early stage of the season needed no help at all. This dish disappeared from the table again. By midsummer, once the peas toughened and the potatoes grew larger, and it wouldn't return until the following spring's first harvest. That rhythm, eating according to what the earth actually offered in a given month, shaped an entire relationship with food that modern grocery stores, stocked identically in every season, have almost completely erased. Number 34. Fried shredded cabbage cooked slowly in bacon fat until it turns soft, slightly caramelized at the edges, and deeply savory in a way raw cabbage never suggests it could become. A little vinegar or apple cider vinegar gets added near the end, cutting through the richness of the fat and brightening the whole dish. This was a way of transforming one of the cheapest, most abundant vegetables in an Amish garden into something worth genuinely looking forward to, rather than simply tolerating. Cabbage stored remarkably well through the fall and into winter, making it one of the last fresh vegetables available before a household had to rely entirely on canned and root cellar goods. Fried in real fat, with real patience, it became something far more interesting than its reputation as a humble, even unwanted vegetable might suggest. Grandma just called it fried cabbage, made without a second thought on a Tuesday evening, using a vegetable that cost almost nothing and a fat that would otherwise have been discarded after breakfast. Two things nobody else wanted, combined into a dish an entire family looked forward to eating. Number 33. Green bean casserole. Fresh green beans, blanched briefly, get folded into a homemade cream sauce built from butter, flour, and milk, then topped with fried onions made by hand, sliced thin, dredged lightly in flour, and fried until genuinely crisp, not the prepackaged, shelf-stable version found in stores today. This dish predates the version most Americans know by decades, built in Amish and Pennsylvania Dutch kitchens, using whatever cream, butter, and green beans a family's own garden and dairy cow could provide. The fried onions took real effort, standing over a skillet, watching carefully so they didn't burn, draining them on paper before they went anywhere near the casserole dish. That effort mattered because it was the difference between a passable dish and one people actually requested by name at gatherings. Today, most Americans assume this casserole was invented by a soup company printed on the back of a can as a marketing gimmick in the 1950s. It wasn't. Amish and farm kitchens were building this exact combination: beans, cream, crisp onions, long before any corporation figured out how to sell it back to America in a can. Number 32. Wilted lettuce, salad fresh garden lettuce, torn by hand, gets doused with a hot dressing made from bacon grease, vinegar, and a touch of sugar, poured directly over the leaves just before serving, so they soften slightly under the heat without turning fully limp. Crumbled bacon and sliced hard-boiled egg finish the dish, adding both protein and richness to what would otherwise be a very light, very simple salad. This was a distinctly seasonal dish, appearing only in late spring and early summer, when lettuce grew abundant and tender in Amish gardens, disappearing again once the heat of midsummer made lettuce bitter and tough. The hot dressing served a practical purpose beyond flavor. It helped the lettuce hold up slightly longer on the table during a large family meal, rather than wilting unattractively under its own moisture. This salad asked almost nothing of the pantry. Bacon grease, saved from breakfast in a jar kept by the stove, vinegar already on hand, and a garden that gave freely for a few precious weeks each year before moving on to whatever vegetable came next in its own natural rotation. Number 31. Corn fritters field corn, cut fresh from the cob at the height of summer, mixed into a simple batter of flour, egg, and milk, then dropped by spoonfuls into a skillet of hot lard until each fritter turns golden and slightly crisp at the edges. The corn's natural sweetness came through clearly against the savory, slightly salty batter, and a fritter fresh from the pan needed nothing more than a pat of butter melting across its surface. This dish arrived specifically during corn season, a way of using the abundance of late summer before it passed. When a single row of field corn could produce more ears than any family could eat fresh before it turned starchy and tough. Corn fritters stretched that abundance across several meals, frying up a large batch at once for both dinner and the next day's breakfast. In Amish farming communities, where corn was grown as both a cash crop and a family food source, using it in every possible form, fresh, dried, ground, fried, was simply good sense. Nothing about the harvest was permitted to go to waste. And a fritter, golden and crackling, straight from the fat, was one of the more delicious ways that principle played out. Number 24. Choufle pie, dessert version. The dessert version served after supper rather than alongside morning coffee. The same molasses, brown sugar, and buttery crumb topping as its breakfast counterpart, but often built slightly sweeter, slightly denser, meant to close out a meal rather than begin a day. This pie exists in two distinct styles across Pennsylvania Dutch country: a wet bottom version with a gooey, almost pudding-like molasses layer beneath the crumbs, and a dry bottom version that bakes more evenly throughout, closer to a spice cake in texture. Amish and Mennonite bakers have debated the merits of each style for generations, each family fiercely loyal to whichever version their own grandmother made. Molasses, far cheaper than refined white sugar throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries, made this pie accessible to families who could never have afforded a dessert built around expensive granulated sugar. This was not a lesser dessert built from a cheaper substitute. This was an entirely different dessert with its own distinct flavor, deep, slightly bitter, faintly smoky, that white sugar could never have produced in the first place. Number 23. Green tomato pie built specifically to use the unripe tomatoes left behind after the first fall frost. This pie mimics the texture and tartness of a traditional apple pie so closely that many people who taste it blind cannot immediately identify what fruit or vegetable, in this case, they're actually eating. Thinly sliced green tomatoes get tossed with sugar, cinnamon, and a bit of flour to thicken the filling, then baked between two crusts until the tomatoes soften into something tender and slightly translucent. Their natural tartness balanced by the sugar into a flavor remarkably close to a Granny Smith apple. This pie solved an immediate seasonal problem: an entire harvest of tomatoes that frost had cut short before they could ripen on the vine. Rather than treating those green tomatoes as a failure of timing, Amish and Pennsylvania Dutch cooks treated them as an opportunity for an entirely different dessert. This was not apple pie's cheap cousin. This was its own distinct dish, built from ingredients that would otherwise have directly to the compost heap, transformed instead into something a family looked forward to eating every single autumn when the frost came early and the vines still held fruit. Number 22. Vanilla pie. Built from little more than sugar, flour, butter, and vanilla extract, thickened into a smooth, pale custard, and baked between crusts until just barely set. This pie represents perhaps the purest expression of Amish frugality in dessert form. A pie that requires no fruit at all, no seasonal harvest, nothing beyond pantry staples nearly every household kept on hand year-round. In winter months, when fresh or preserved fruit ran low, and a family still wanted something sweet to close a meal, vanilla pie filled that exact gap. The filling turns a deep golden color as it bakes, with a texture somewhere between a custard and a very soft caramel, faintly reminiscent of a butterscotch pudding. This pie asked almost nothing of a household's resources beyond what was always already there, making it perhaps the single most reliable dessert an Amish cook could produce regardless of season, harvest, or how thin the pantry had grown by February. That is not deprivation. That is ingenuity. The specific skill of building something genuinely delicious from ingredients that required no special trip to the store and no waiting for a particular fruit to come back into season. Number 21. Apple dumplings, whole apples, cored but left intact, wrapped completely in a buttery pastry dough, and baked in a sweet cinnamon sugar syrup until the apple softens fully inside its dough casing and the syrup thickens around it into something close to caramel. Served warm, often with a splash of cream poured over the top. This dessert transformed a single apple into something that felt significantly more indulgent than the fruit alone ever could. Apple orchards were common on Amish farms across Pennsylvania and Ohio, producing far more fruit each fall than any family could eat fresh or even preserve entirely through canning and drying. Dumplings offered another use for that abundance, turning even slightly bruised or imperfect apples, the ones too damaged to sell at market but still perfectly good to eat, into a dessert nobody would ever guess started from a flawed piece of fruit. The dough itself required real skill, rolled thin enough to wrap fully around the apple without tearing, yet sturdy enough to hold its shape through a long bake in bubbling syrup. This was a dessert built specifically around using what the orchard provided, regardless of whether every single apple happened to be perfect enough for a fruit stand. Number 20. Raisin pie, funeral pie. Dried raisins, plumped in water and simmered with sugar, a touch of lemon, and warm spices until they thicken into a dark, jammy filling, baked between two crusts into a pie specifically associated with death and mourning in Pennsylvania Dutch tradition. The name comes from a simple practical reality. Raisins, unlike fresh fruit, kept on a pantry shelf year-round, meaning a pie could be assembled on short notice whenever a community needed to feed mourners gathered for a funeral, regardless of season. No garden had to be checked. No fruit had to be in ripeness. The pantry always had raisins, and raisins always meant this pie could exist within hours of a death being announced. There is something quietly profound about a dessert built entirely around reliability during during a community's hardest moments, a dish that never once let grief wait on the calendar or the growing season. Funeral pie was never meant to be celebratory. It was meant to simply be present, consistently. Whenever a family needed something sweet to offer visitors while they buried someone they loved. Number 19. Rhubarb custard pie. Among the very first plants to emerge from an Amish garden each spring, rhubarb arrives tart, fibrous, and completely inedible on its own, requiring generous sugar and careful cooking to transform it into something palatable. Diced and mixed with a rich custard of eggs, sugar, and a touch of flour, rhubarb bakes down into a tender, faintly tangy filling that balances the sweetness of the custard against the vegetables. Natural sharpness. This pie marked a genuine seasonal milestone, the first fresh dessert available after a long winter of pies built entirely from preserved fruit, dried raisins, or pantry staples like vanilla and molasses. Rhubarb grew reliably even in poor soil and required almost no maintenance beyond harvesting, making it one of the earliest, most dependable sources of fresh flavor each year. In many Amish households, the first rhubarb pie of spring carried a small sense of celebration, a marker that the harshest part of winter had genuinely passed and the garden was beginning to provide again. That anticipation, built around waiting patiently for a single tart vegetable to emerge from the thawing ground, represents a relationship with seasonality that most modern kitchens, stocked with imported produce year-round, have entirely lost. Number 18. Amish sugar cookies, soft, thick, and made with oil rather than butter. This cookie stays tender for days, rather than turning hard and crumbly the way many traditional sugar cookies do. Sour cream often gets folded into the dough as well, adding both moisture and a faint tang that balances the cookie's sweetness. Unlike rolled sugar cookies that require chilling and careful cutting, this dough gets simply scooped and flattened by hand, sometimes with the bottom of a glass dipped in sugar, making it a cookie children could genuinely help bake without requiring precision or patience. That accessibility mattered in households with many children who wanted to be useful in the kitchen. A large batch could be mixed and baked in under an hour, filling a cookie jar that would need refilling again within days in a large family. Grandma just called it sugar cookies, though the texture, soft, slightly cakey, tender enough to remain good 3 or 4 days later, set this recipe apart from nearly every other version of sugar cookie found across the rest of the country. Number 17. Whoopie pies. 2 soft, cake-like cookies, usually chocolate, sometimes pumpkin or ginger, depending on the season, sandwiched around a filling of sweetened marshmallow cream and shortening, whipped until light and fluffy. Pennsylvania Dutch tradition claims this dessert as its own, though its exact origin remains genuinely disputed among food historians. What isn't disputed is its role at Amish church gatherings, school lunches, and family celebrations for well over a century. The name itself supposedly comes from the exclamation children made upon finding one tucked into their lunch pail. A small, unexpected joy in an otherwise plain meal of bread and whatever protein could be spared. Made in large batches, whoopie pies traveled well, held up in a lunch pail through a morning of farm chores or a school day, and required no refrigeration despite the cream filling, thanks to the shortening base rather than butter or dairy cream. Today, gourmet bakeries in cities far from any Amish community sell elaborate, artisanal versions of this exact cookie for $6 or $7 apiece, decorated and photographed for social media. The original version cost the price of cocoa, flour, sugar, and a jar of marshmallow fluff, pennies per pie, made purely to bring a small, genuine smile to a child's face at lunchtime. Number 16. peanut butter bars. A simple, no-fuss dessert built around a base of peanut butter, powdered sugar, and butter pressed into a pan, then topped with a layer of melted chocolate that hardens into a firm shell once cooled. This dessert required no oven at all in some variations, making it a reliable option even on the hottest summer days when firing up a wood stove for baking felt genuinely unbearable. Peanut butter, an affordable and shelf-stable pantry staple by the mid-20th century, offered a way to build a rich, satisfying dessert without needing fresh fruit, dairy cream, or anything requiring refrigeration. Cut into small squares, these bars traveled well to church gatherings, school lunches, and community auctions, holding their shape and texture for days without spoiling. The recipe asked for almost nothing beyond what most Amish pantries already kept in steady supply, and required minimal time standing over a hot stove during months when the kitchen itself became one of the warmest rooms in the entire house. Practical, sweet, and genuinely easy to make in large batches. These bars solved a specific summer problem that many traditional baked desserts simply couldn't. Number 15. Molasses cookies, dark, spiced, and chewy, built around molasses rather than white sugar as the primary sweetener. These cookies carry a deep, almost smoky sweetness that granulated sugar alone could never replicate. Ginger, cinnamon, and cloves round out the spice profile, giving the cookie a warmth particularly suited to cold winter months, when a batch baking in the oven filled an entire farmhouse with its scent. Molasses remained significantly cheaper than refined sugar well into the 20th century, a byproduct of sugar refining that was often sold at a fraction of the cost, making it the sweetener of choice for households watching every penny. Rolled in sugar before baking, these cookies develop a slightly crackled top as they spread in the oven, with a chewy center that stays soft for days after baking, unlike many crisper cookies that turn stale within a day or two. This was winter baking at its most practical, a cookie built from cheap, shelf-stable ingredients, capable of lasting in a tin for over a week without losing its texture, ready whenever a family needed something sweet during the long, dark months when fresh baking ingredients grew scarce and every trip to town meant hitching a horse in freezing weather. Number 14. Date. Pinwheel cookies, a simple butter cookie dough, rolled thin, spread with a cooked filling of chopped dates, and a bit of sugar and water simmered until jammy, then rolled up tightly into a log and chilled before being sliced into individual pinwheels and baked. The spiral pattern that emerges once sliced made these cookies feel considerably more special than their humble ingredients. Suggested a small visual flourish achieved through technique rather than expense. Dates, dried and shelf-stable, could be purchased in bulk and stored for months without spoiling, making them a rare exotic ingredient that even a frugal Amish household could justify keeping on hand for special occasions. Stretching a single package of dates across an entire batch of cookies meant a small luxury ingredient could go considerably further than eating them plain ever would. These cookies appeared most often around the holidays or for guests, a slightly more elevated offering than the everyday sugar or molasses cookies filling the jar the rest of the year. The visual spiral, achieved with nothing more than careful rolling and a sharp knife, proved that impressive presentation never actually required an expensive ingredient, just patience and a steady hand at the cutting board. Number 13. Graham Cracker Squares. An icebox dessert requiring no oven at all, graham crackers layered with a simple sweetened cream filling, sometimes chocolate pudding, then chilled until the crackers soften and meld into the filling, creating a texture closer to cake than the original crisp cracker. Cut into neat squares once fully set, this dessert became a favorite for hot summer days and large gatherings. since it could be assembled entirely ahead of time and required nothing more than refrigerator space to finish. Graham crackers, sold cheaply in boxes at general stores by the early 20th century, offered a shelf-stable base that Amish cooks could keep on hand for exactly this purpose. The lack of baking made this dessert particularly practical during the hottest months, when the kitchen itself often reached unbearable temperatures from cooking 3 full meals a day for a large family. Simple, cool, and requiring almost no active effort beyond assembly, this dessert proved that a genuinely satisfying sweet didn't always need an oven, a mixing bowl of flour, or hours of standing over a hot stove during the one season when that heat felt most unwelcome. Number 12. Meadow tea, mint tea. Fresh mint grown wild or cultivated along the edges of an Amish garden, steeped in hot water and sweetened with sugar, then chilled and served over ice during the hottest days of summer. This drink required nothing beyond what nearly every farm already had, growing somewhere on the property. Mint spreads aggressively and needs almost no cultivation to thrive, making it one of the few genuinely free ingredients an Amish household could rely on. Brewed by the pitcher and kept cold in a springhouse or icebox, meadow tea became the default beverage served to farmhands during harvest season, when sweet tea's sugar provided a quick source of energy during long hours of physical labor under direct sun. The mint itself carried a cooling sensation on the tongue that felt genuinely refreshing in 90-degree heat, more so than plain water alone ever managed. This wasn't a beverage bought at a store or mixed from a powdered packet. It was quite literally grown along the garden's edge, picked fresh that same afternoon, and turned into something a tired field worker could drink glass after glass of, without a single ingredient having cost the family anything at all. Number 11. Switchel, Haymaker's Punch. A drink built specifically for the hardest physical labor of the farming calendar. Apple cider vinegar, ginger, and molasses stirred into water, then served ice cold to farmhands working through the brutal heat of hay season. The vinegar's sharpness, combined with ginger's warmth and molasses's mineral-rich sweetness, created a drink that modern sports science would later validate almost entirely by accident. Vinegar helps replace electrolytes lost through sweat. Ginger settles a stomach unsettled by heat and exertion. Molasses carries genuine iron and potassium, nutrients a body desperately needs after hours in a hayfield under direct summer sun. Amish farming families were mixing this exact combination generations before any sports drink existed, relying entirely on ingredients already sitting in the pantry rather than anything purchased specifically for hydration. That is not a coincidence, and that is not folk medicine working by luck. That is generations of careful observation about what actually helped a body recover from brutal physical labor, refined slowly over time until the recipe became standard practice across entire farming communities. A modern electrolyte drink, sold in a brightly colored bottle for several dollars, contains dye, artificial flavoring, and a fraction of the real nutrition a glass of switchel delivered for the cost of vinegar and molasses, already sitting on the shelf. Number 10. Homemade root beer built from sassafras root, sarsaparilla, and other wild botanicals gathered from nearby woods, combined with sugar and yeast, then left to ferment briefly in stoneware crocks until naturally carbonated. This wasn't the mass-produced soda most Americans know today. It was a slow, deliberate process, requiring genuine knowledge of which roots and barks produce the right flavor, foraged directly from the same land the family farmed rather than purchased from any store. In many Amish communities, root beer became a special occasion treat, brewed in smaller batches specifically for summer gatherings, church picnics, or as a reward after a particularly demanding stretch of farm work. The natural fermentation process gave this root beer a slightly tangier, more complex flavor than modern commercial versions, which rely almost entirely on artificial flavoring rather than actual roots and barks. Making a proper batch required real botanical knowledge passed down through generations, which plants to use, in what proportion, gathered at exactly the right time of year for maximum flavor. That knowledge has largely vanished from most American households, replaced entirely by a can pulled from a refrigerator shelf, its flavor manufactured in a laboratory rather than foraged from an actual forest floor. Number 9. Popcorn balls. Freshly popped corn, still warm, bound together with a hot molasses or sugar syrup, then shaped by hand into individual balls before the syrup fully hardens. This treat solved a specific practical problem in Amish households. Popcorn, grown easily on the family farm and stored dried through winter, provided an endless, essentially free source of a crunchy snack. But loose popped corn scattered and made a genuine mess for a large family sharing a single bowl. Shaping it into individual balls, bound with syrup, made the treat portable and mess-free, easily handed to each child without a single kernel escaping across the kitchen floor. Popcorn balls appeared most often during winter evenings when the family gathered around the wood stove after supper or as a specific treat during harvest celebrations and county fairs. Making the syrup required genuine skill, heated to precisely the right temperature so it would set firm enough to hold the ball's shape without turning brittle and shattering the moment a child bit into it. This treat cost almost nothing to make. Built from corn the family had grown themselves and a sweetener already stocked in the pantry, transformed through nothing more than heat, timing, and the patience to shape dozens of individual balls by hand before the syrup cooled. Number 8. Peanut brittle sugar and corn syrup cooked on the stovetop to an exact, precise temperature, then combined with roasted peanuts and poured out thin onto a buttered surface to cool and harden into a glass-like, snappable candy. This was genuinely difficult candy to make correctly. Too little heat and the brittle stays chewy rather than snapping cleanly. Too much heat and the sugar scorches, turning bitter before it ever reaches the pan. Amish cooks who mastered this recipe did so through repetition, learning to judge the syrup's readiness by color and behavior alone, long before instant read candy thermometers made the process considerably more forgiving for less experienced hands. Peanut brittle appeared most often during the holiday season, made in large batches and given as gifts to neighbors, church members, and extended family, broken into jagged pieces and packed into tins. The skill required to make this candy correctly was genuinely respected within the community. Not every woman attempted it, and those who mastered it were often specifically requested to bring a batch to community gatherings. This was candy that demanded real technical skill, refined over years of practice, transformed from nothing more than sugar, corn syrup, and peanuts into something that shattered cleanly with a satisfying snap. Number 7. Graham cracker puddings, sometimes called Amish vanilla pudding, a cooked custard of milk, sugar, and vanilla, thickened on the stovetop until it coats the back of a spoon. Then layered in a dish with crushed graham crackers between each layer of pudding, chilled until fully set. Unlike the boxed pudding mix that would later dominate American kitchens, this pudding began with actual milk and eggs, cooked slowly and stirred constantly to prevent scorching or curdling against the bottom of the pot. The graham cracker layers softened slightly as the dessert chilled, absorbing some of the pudding's moisture and turning almost cake-like by the time it was served the following day. This dessert required real attention at the stove. Pudding cooked too quickly could curdle, cooked too slowly could fail to thicken properly, and there was no packet of instant mix to fall back on if the process went wrong. Amish cooks learned to read the custard's texture by sight and feel alone, a skill built entirely through repetition rather than a set of printed instructions on the back of a cardboard box, producing a dessert with a depth of flavor no instant mix has ever managed to replicate. Number 6. Roshed, wedding chicken filling. While a version of this bread and chicken filling appears at many gatherings, the wedding version carries particular weight, prepared in enormous quantities to feed the entire community attending an Amish wedding celebration, which can often include 200 to 300 guests across an entire day of festivities. Bread cubes, dried specifically for this purpose days in advance, get combined with butter, celery, and a rich broth built from dozens of stewing hens, then baked in massive roasting pans until the filling turns tender throughout with a slightly crisped top layer. The sheer scale of this undertaking required coordination among many women in the community, often beginning preparation 2 full days before the wedding itself. Nothing about feeding a community this size happened casually or at the last minute. This dish represents something particularly important about Amish culture. Celebration built entirely around communal effort rather than commercial catering. Every single dish prepared by hand within the community itself for the community's own benefit. There is no caterer's invoice for an Amish wedding. There is only dozens of women working together across 2 full days, transforming bread, chicken, and broth into a meal substantial enough to feed everyone who came to witness 2 people begin a life together. Number 5. Mashed potato candy. This is exactly what it sounds like, and it genuinely works. Plain mashed potatoes, cooled completely, get combined with powdered sugar and a touch of vanilla until the mixture forms a workable dough. Then rolled flat, spread with peanut butter, and rolled up into a log before being sliced into individual pinwheels. The potato itself contributes almost no flavor to the finished candy. Its role is purely textural, acting as a binder that allows the powdered sugar to form a smooth, fudge-like consistency without requiring cream, condensed milk, or any dairy product that might not always be on hand. This candy appeared almost exclusively around Christmas in many Amish households. A specific holiday tradition built from an ingredient every single family always had in abundant supply, regardless of how tight money happened to be that particular winter. Nothing about this candy required a special trip to the store or an ingredient reserved specifically for special occasions. A leftover scoop of mashed potatoes, something most kitchens already had on hand after any dinner, became the foundation for a holiday treat that tasted nothing like a vegetable and everything like a genuine celebratory sweet. Number 4. Christmas cookies, anise-spiced. Rolled thin and cut into simple shapes, these cookies carry the distinct, slightly licorice-like flavor of anise seed, a spice specifically associated with the Christmas season across Pennsylvania Dutch and Amish communities. Baked until just set, with a texture closer to a crisp shortbread than a soft sugar cookie, these cookies often appeared stamped with simple designs pressed into the dough before baking. A small decorative flourish achieved without any icing, sprinkles, or elaborate decoration. Anise seed, distinct and somewhat polarizing in flavor, became specifically tied to this one time of year in many households, appearing in no other recipe throughout the remaining 11 months. That specificity mattered. A flavor reserved entirely for Christmas carried genuine anticipation with it, a taste children associated exclusively with the holiday season, rather than something available whenever they wanted it. Baked in large batches and stored in tins that lasted through the entire Christmas season. These cookies represented one of the few times of year an Amish household leaned into a specific, somewhat unusual flavor purely for the sake of tradition and seasonal celebration, rather than practicality alone. Number 3. Church Spread. Peanut Butter Marshmallow Spread. 3. Church Spread, sometimes called Peanut Butter Marshmallow Spread. Peanut butter, marshmallow cream, and corn syrup whipped together into a fluffy, sweet spread served specifically at communion meals following Amish church services, spread thickly over slices of homemade bread. This spread carries genuine religious and communal significance beyond simply being a tasty combination of ingredients. Following the multi-hour church service, held in a rotating member's home, rather than a dedicated church building, the community shares a meal together, and this spread appears specifically as part of that shared communion meal, a tradition maintained consistently across generations. The combination itself required no refrigeration and could be made in large batches well ahead of time, practical for a meal that needed to feed the entire congregation without requiring last-minute preparation on the morning of the service itself. Children in particular associated this spread specifically with church Sundays, a treat they knew to expect only on that particular day of the week rather than any other. That weekly rhythm, a specific food tied to a specific recurring communal gathering, reinforced the connection between faith, food, and community in a way few other dishes in the entire Amish culinary tradition manage quite so directly. Number 2. Baked Oatmeal 2. Baked oatmeal. Rolled oats combined with eggs, milk, brown sugar, and cinnamon, baked in a dish until it sets into something closer to a dense cake than traditional stovetop oatmeal, sliced into squares and served warm with milk poured over the top. This dish became a specific Sunday morning tradition in many Amish households, prepared the evening before and simply reheated the following morning, since cooking was kept minimal on the Sabbath in many communities. Unlike a bowl of plain oatmeal, this baked version could be made entirely ahead of time, sliced and served, without any last-minute stovetop attention required on a morning meant for rest and worship rather than kitchen labor. Fruit, diced apples, blueberries, or whatever the pantry had preserved, often got folded into the batter, varying the dish slightly depending on the season and what had been canned or dried the previous fall. This wasn't a hurried breakfast eaten standing at a counter. It was a dish specifically designed to allow an entire family to sit down together on a Sunday morning without anyone needing to stand over a hot stove. Number 1. Fry pies. Fried hand pies. 1. Fry pies. A simple pastry dough, rolled thin and filled with a spoonful of fruit preserves, apple, peach, or cherry, depending on what had been canned the previous season. Folded over into a half-moon shape, sealed at the edges, and fried in hot lard until the crust turns deep golden brown and blisters slightly across its surface. Dusted with powdered sugar or dipped briefly in a simple glaze while still warm, these hand pies became a specific fixture at Amish farmers markets, roadside stands, and county fairs, sold individually for a nickel or a dime well into the mid-20th century. Unlike a full pie requiring a fork and a plate, fry pies traveled easily in one hand, perfect for a farmhand eating on the move or a child carrying one home from a market stall wrapped in wax paper. The fruit filling meant an entire jar of preserves. Put up during the previous summer's canning season, could be stretched across dozens of individual pies, rather than a single dessert meant to feed only one family at one sitting. This was portable, affordable, genuinely delicious food sold at the edge of a market table by women who had learned to fry a crust to that exact shade of golden brown through nothing more than years of doing it over and over until their hands simply knew. Conclusions: 60 recipes. 60 ways of proving that a family with almost nothing could still eat like they had everything they needed. Try the chicken corn soup this week. Simmer that whole hen slowly and taste what an actual bird tastes like when it isn't rushed. Fry a batch of peanut brittle for the holidays and feel what it means to earn a candy through real skill instead of a packet mix. Roll out a fry pie with whatever preserves are sitting in your own cellar. And understand that a nickel's worth of dough once carried an entire family's Saturday market income. These women were never poor cooks working around a lack of options. They were master craftswomen, working within a discipline. Most of America abandoned the moment convenience became available at any price. Every jar of chow chow, every pot of pot liquor's Amish cousin, every hand-rolled noodle proves it. They knew things about patience, preservation, and using every last piece of an animal or a harvest that we will spend the next 50 years trying to remember, one expensive artisanal product at a time. That is not progress. Watching a company charge $15 for a rustic chowder built from ingredients a farm family once considered simply Tuesday supper. That is a specific kind of theft. Charging modern America a premium to relearn what an Amish grandmother already knew for free. She was right. Every one of these women standing over every one of these stoves was write comment below and tell me which one your grandmother made.